Bon dia a tots, moltes gràcies per ser aquí, un cop més. I would like to thank Sarah Katan for being here to this third ECO-SOS workshop on economics and sustainability. It is a pleasure for me to introduce her to Professor Sarah Katan, who will be the keynote speaker, and she's going to talk us about the first generation elite, the role of school networks. Professor Sarah Katan holds a degree in economics and political science from Columbia University. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And a master and PhD in economics at University of Chicago. Actually, she is Associate Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies in London. In particular, she is the head of the education and skills sector. Her research interests include the origins of inequality and the role of human capital played in driving inequalities within across the generations. She has also conducted projects looking for the determinants of early childhood development, the impact of early childhood and education policies, and gender wage gap. She has a long list of publications that appear, among others, in American Economic Review, Fiscal Studies, PNAS, the Economic Journal, among others. I'm sure that her experience will be very enriching for us, so we are very interested in everything you can tell us. Please, Sarah, once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for such nice introduction. Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for such nice introduction, and thank you very much for having me today. I'm really delighted to be giving the keynote presentation at the ECO-SOS workshop. I have to say, on my way here, I felt a little bit as an imposter because the paper that I suggested presenting today which I really am very excited about, is not specifically about gender. However, looking at the program of the workshop, I thought that it would actually be quite linked to a lot of the different topics that are going to be talked about today, including inequality, human capital, biases and stereotypes. And so I thought that you will find it interesting. So thanks a lot for having me here. I'm very happy to take questions throughout, so feel free to interrupt. Okay, so the paper I'm going to present is based on joint work with Kjell Salvanes from the Norwegian School of Economics and Emma Tomini from the University of York. And as Corit said, it's about intergenerational mobility, and especially the role of social networks and of social capital in driving mobility. So a little bit of motivation to start. Essentially, we wanted to study this topic because there's a lot of evidence showing that there is very strong intergenerational persistence in education. And that is really something that is found across a variety of contexts, not only in high inequality countries like the US or the UK, but also actually in very low inequality contexts like Scandinavian countries. Moreover, this persistence has been found to be particularly high at the top end of the education distribution. So when we're thinking about higher education, and even more when we're thinking about those elite education. So I'll be very precise about what we call elite education in our context very soon, but in the sort of recent literature, we're thinking about selective, prestigious higher education institutions or degrees. Raschetti has produced a couple of pretty dramatic statistics about this in the US, finding that 70% of Harvard students come from the top 20% of the income distribution, only 3% come from the bottom 20. in Norway, which is the context that we study, there is this ratio is less stark, but it is very much there. And why does this matter? Well, we know from quite a couple of different papers that there are high labor market returns to elite degrees, and so if we could, bring more students from low socioeconomic backgrounds to pursue these educational routes, it might go a long way in reducing socioeconomic inequality. Interestingly, yeah.
Next question. So, do we have any evidence whether this might take more than one generation to, go up the ladder, so that maybe you have this persistence, but eventually,
it gets better.
Yeah, it gets better.
Yeah. So I think the only paper that looks at a lot of different generations is a very recent paper looking at the Chile context. And while there is a slight progress across generation, it is quite slow. So a lot of the explanations that have been proposed for why this process is actually so slow actually are not so relevant when you think about the Norwegian context. So first, in Norway there are no tuition fees, university tuition fees, and so you wouldn't think that financial constraints would be a very salient sort of driver like they could be in the US. In addition, in Norway, there is a very sort of merit-based admission system to university where admissions are all governed by a centralized system that takes into account the students' preferences or ranking of degrees as well as their GPA. So there are no sort of legacy admission systems like they are in the US, which can really sort of distort the process. So in this paper, we're actually going to look at another sort of explanation, which is the role of social capital in driving these inequalities. There's been a growing interest in this type of hypothesis in the literature, and more recently, again, some work by Chelly using Facebook data actually finds some important correlations between how well connected friends from different socioeconomic backgrounds are with the level of mobility in that area. So in this paper, we're going to try and build on this and push a little bit further in providing causal evidence about the role of school social networks in driving intergenerational mobility. And we're going to place quite a bit of importance on digging into the mechanisms underlying these impacts. So let me define what we mean by elite education and elite peers, which is going to be the main characteristics of those school networks that we're interested in. So the paper is going to be about whether an exposure to elite peers in high school shapes elite education decisions and why. So what do we mean by elite peers? We're going to be looking at the peers whose parents have an elite education. And we're going to define the school network as the cohort in the high school that the pupil is in. And so our main sort of measure of social capital is going to be the fraction of elite educated parents in the student's high school cohort. And just to establish something, I will show you some statistics later on, but just to establish something that is really sort of driving why we're interested in this question, because of the way the high school system is shaped in Norway, there is in high school a lot of segregation of these elite peers. So these pupils from elite educated families are much more likely to be in high schools with other pupils from elite education families than pupils from non-elite backgrounds. And so, this segregation, if indeed this exposure to elite peers is important in shaping later outcomes, this segregation of elite peers could already sort of be driving the inequalities we see in later outcomes. So that's going to be a fundamental question that we try to answer in the paper. Now, what do we mean by elite education? So our main sort of outcome of interest is going to be whether a student enrolls in an elite degree. In Norway, those are very commonly defined as 5-year, so bachelor and master's degrees in business and engineering, law and medicine at very few elite institutions. So it's a combination of institution and subject. Those elite degrees are very selective. We only see 3 to 4% of every cohort eventually enrolling in those. So it is very comparable to, you know, sort of Ivy League or in the Oxbridge sort of universities in the UK. And we also see that they're very much associated with very high-paying positions. So by age 30, 32, in Norway, those with elite degrees are significantly more likely to be in the top end of the earnings distribution. So now, before just getting into exactly what we do in the paper, let's just think a little bit about, you know, why we would think that being exposed to these elite peers, so, you know, peers from elite education families in high school, could shape the outcomes we're interested in. So we can sort of think about two different margins. The first one is thinking about how those elite peers might influence high school GPA. As I said, high school GPA is a really core determinant of whether you end up in an elite degree or not, because you need to have a very high high school GPA for that. And so if we think about the classroom environment, or the school environment, on the one hand, the peer literature sort of tells us that those very high achieving peers, or those elite peers were going to tend to be very high achieving, could have positive or negative spillovers on the learning of other students in the cohort. But also, in the Norwegian context, GPA is not only based on sort of blindly assessed exams, where you could sort of pick up this effect of, you know, on effort or learning, but GPA is also based on teacher assessments. And so you could think that the presence of those elite peers in the classroom actually distort the way that teachers assess other students in the class. So we'll be really looking into that. Overall, a priori, it's sort of very difficult to say whether we would think elite peers have a positive or a negative effect on high school grades, on high school GPA, but that will be you know, one of the key channels we're going to be looking at in the paper. The second sort of margin that those elite peers could affect is on the application behavior of those students who have a high school GPA that is high enough to pretend to an elite degree. But the presence or the exposure to these elite peers, or their families actually, could change whether or not they apply, or it could change which universities and degrees they apply to. And so we think that conditional on the GPA, the exposure to elite peers could also affect, you know, the eventual outcomes of whether they enroll in an elite degree or not. And this mechanism would mostly reflect the fact that, you know, those elite peers or their parents who have gone through the elite route, educational route, could provide information about these degrees, or they could, you know, sort of raise their aspirations as well to pursue these ambitious routes. So overall, we think, you know, the effect is sort of ambiguously signed, but it's also perhaps likely to be different for students at different points of the socioeconomic distributions and of the ability distribution. And that's going to be a key question that we look at. Just to give you a little bit of a roadmap for my presentation. So first, we're going to start by looking at what is the overall effect of elite peers on elite degree enrollment. And we're going to ask whether this effect is different for for students who have elite educated parents themselves from those who don't. And as you will see, we find actually that those elite peers are an encouraging or positive force in driving more students to pursue elite degrees, but there is a very strong social gradient in the magnitude of this effect. So the high SES students benefit more from being surrounded by other elite students than the students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So then the rest of the paper is about why we find this. So as I said, we're going to be looking at those two margins. The first one, we're going to look at what is the effect of elite peers on GPA. And we will dig a little bit more into this by exploiting the fact that in Norway, GPA is composed of blindly assessed exams as well as teacher assessments. And you will see we're finding very different results on both types of exams. Then, once we've established that, we're going to be looking at what is the effect conditional on GPA, what is the effect of elite peers on the decision of enrolling in an elite degree conditional on GPA. So this would be the sort of second margin I talked about. And we're going to be running a mediation analysis to quantify the importance of this channel relative to the channel going through GPA. And then lastly, we're going to be thinking about the sort of long-term implications of those elite peers, now not on education or intergenerational persistence in education, but in earnings. And here the crucial parameter will be the returns to these elite degrees and, on earnings. And so we'll be showing descriptive evidence about what those could be for both low and high SES students, and then thinking about what that means for intergenerational mobility, income mobility. All right. So let me start by telling you a little bit about our research design. Can I just ask what time I need to stop? Or what time did we start?
10 minutes to 10, 5 minutes to 10, but if you want to extend a little bit, we are flexible.
5 minutes to 10, yeah. So it would be another half hour.
Yeah.
Okay, another 25, okay. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about the institutional background. So first, in the high school system, at the end of middle school, so when the children are age 16, the students they have to choose to go either on an academic track or a vocational track. We're really going to be focusing on the academic track, which is the main way to get to university. Depending on where you live, and actually on which year of birth you are, which year you were born in, there are two sort of ways to be admitted to high school. In some areas, it's based on distance, so there are catchment areas around the high school. In other areas, it's a selective system, so it's based on your middle school GPA. And this middle school GPA is essentially done, it's based on exams done during the 3 years of middle school. Now, once you get to the end of this academic high school, most students will apply and actually enroll in a higher education degree. And they can go for a 3-year bachelor or 5-year bachelor-master's degree. Those elite degrees, as I said, that we're considering are 5-year degrees in a couple of subjects at a few elite institutions. And the students applies to a combination of a course and institution, and they do so through the centralized admission system that I talked about earlier. All of the analysis is going to be based on administrative register data from Norway. And this is really nice data to conduct this sort of analysis, because it's going to link the students' educational records to their labor markets, if they're in age to be in the labor market. But it's also going to link them to their parents' information, as well as to their peers and peers' parents' information. So this is how we're going to construct those measures of our main measure of the school network. Our sample is going to be composed of students finishing middle school and entering this academic high school track between 2002 and 2012. And like I said, we're going to be very interested in seeing whether there are differential effects of this exposure to elite peers for students at the bottom or at the top of the SES distribution. We're going to define those in our low SES group as those students who have at least one parent with only the compulsory level of education and no parent with an elite degree. And we're going to define the high SES group as those students who have at least one parent with an elite degree and no parent with compulsory level of education. So here we're focusing on relatively sort of, a bit of the extremes, but we've done everything with this, also the middle group, everything sort of follows. But we decided that for presentational purposes, we would focus on those two groups. So our main outcome is going to be an indicator for whether a youth I in high school S and the cohort C enrolled in an elite degree within 6 years of middle school completion, and this is to allow for some time to take a gap year or to do the military service, as is often the case in Norway. And our main outcome essentially, so we see that in our sample, there is 10% of students who enroll in an elite degree, but there is a strong gradient with the high SES students being 5 times more likely than the low SES students to enroll in an elite degree. Now our main treatment variable is the proportion of elite educated parents in the youth school cohort, so SC, excluding the focal students' own parents. Okay, so this is a variable that will vary at the individual level. In the sample, we have about 6% on average of parents with an elite degree across all students. But again, like I was saying, because of the segregation into high schools, the high SES students are more likely to be exposed to elite peers than the low SES students. So our goal is going to be to identify the effect of those elite peers, this proportion of elite educated parents in the school cohort, on whether students enrolled in an elite degree. And to do that, we're going to be exploiting within school and between cohort variation. So we're going to operationalize this. So this is a very sort of typical identification strategy in the peers literature, and I will tell you a little bit more about how we defend its validity in our context. But essentially, the main sort of regression that we're going to estimate is the following, where we have so our indicator for whether the student enrolls in an elite degree, or that we regress on this proportion of peers' parents in the school cohort with an elite degree. This we will standardize it to have a standard deviation 1. And then we also control for students' characteristics, including gender, their middle school GPA, which could be a proxy for their ability coming into high school, their parents' years of schooling, whether their parents have an elite degree, the family's income, and whether they were born in Norway. And then we include a set of school fixed effects and cohort fixed effects. So the coefficient of interest here is going to be beta 1, which is the effect of a 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of elite parents and on the likelihood to enroll in an elite degree. So in order to identify this beta 1, so first we need to have enough variation in this proportion of elite peers. And we see that, conditional on school and cohort fixed effects, we actually still have quite a lot of variation, only so about just half of the variation once we include the school and cohort fixed effects. But also the crucial identifying assumption here is that once we control so once we look at the variation within school, any variation in this proportion of elite peers from one cohort to the next is random. Okay? That is conditional on the X's, which are student characteristics. So this strategy essentially does allow parents and students to select into high schools based on their ability, based on their preferences. Those would be captured by the school fixed effects and their the X's. However, there is a degree to which we assume that parents or students are not able to predict exactly what the composition of the student body is going to be, in the year that they apply. Okay, and we do a lot of different checks to validate this assumption.
Wouldn't the capacity of the parents to understand what's going to be the degree of difficulty of the school based on their education? I would expect like a wealthy family with a PhD knows better which kind of challenges is the kid will face during certain high school or not than a family that does never go to university, and they may overestimate or underestimate the difficulty of the different fields.
So are you referring to the admission into universities or into high school?
Both.
So
the degree of randomness to which parents may not understand how to allocate the kid is may be related to their socioeconomic background.
Yeah, so that high SES parents would be more able to predict because they get more information about. No, that would be something that we would be concerned about. Now the way that we try to deal with this is that, as you will see, so we're going to try essentially 3 different things. One is to include school-specific trends, so linear trends, and see whether we're getting sort of the same effect with, allowing schools to be on different trends, linear trends. The second one is that we're going to look at actually the trends in the proportion of those elite peers in each school, and essentially drop those where it looks like this proportion is on a trend. It's not varying random. It doesn't look like it's just really idiosyncratic variation from one cohort to the next. And we're going to re-estimate the model just on that subsample. And we find very similar effects. And the third thing that we're going to do is that and all of these we're re-estimating separately for low SES and high SES. And it looks very similar and in both groups. So it would sort of give us, I think, confidence that, even if perhaps the threat to identification was higher in the high SES sample, we would still sort of test for it with those robustness checks. And then lastly, we're also going to be re-estimating the model, this time with cohorts interacted with school fixed effects. And here we're only, in this model, we're only able to identify the difference in the elite peer effects between low and high SES students. And again, that difference is very similar to what we find in the benchmark model.
So you have school fixed effects and cohort fixed effects. I would expect that there will be a lot of persistence in this social capital measure, right? So, but you said that there is enough variability. So I guess that then this variability really comes from kind of outliers, no? In the
no, I don't think it does. It's essentially it's coming from changes, small changes from one cohort to the next in who lives in the area. And it's coming from small changes from one year to the next in, who applies to the schools where there's a selective admission system.
Yeah, but this again, just to understand, this is the proportion, the standard rural world of interest is the proportion of elite parents within the cohort. For that particular year, and they are in middle school for 3-4 years, you said, right?
So it's when they get to high school. So it would be if they get to high school.
Sorry, in high school.
In year 2000, academic year 2003-04, we would be looking at the student body for that year in their high school. and computing the proportion of parents for students in that cohort who have an elite degree.
Right, okay.
That would just make it more difficult to find an effect anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if there was a problem with this parameter variable that doesn't vary enough, that would make it more difficult that you find an effect.
Yeah, I think we wouldn't find much.
But you do. So.
Yeah, and it's quite precisely estimated. And actually, we've looked at. I don't have a lot of time, but we've looked very carefully at. We picked like a variety of schools randomly, and we really plotted the sort of year-to-year variation in that variable. So because we're to see. Yes, is it like really those huge jumps maybe from one year to the next that would be more outliers, or is it really like something that seems to be happening in a lot of schools, and there are smaller sort of variation? That's the sort of thing that
And
really
when
is
you
there.
say this interaction, this school cohort fixed effects, the identification comes from where then?
So we cannot estimate the main effect, but essentially, so we can estimate the gradient, so the difference in the effect between the low and the high SES. So we pull the low and the high SES samples together. So they are assumed to have the same school and cohort fixed effects and the same interactions between the two. And so we can only identify the difference between the effect in the high and low SES. Okay? But since we're very interested in that gradient, that is one way of, I think, validating another way of sort of validating the identification strategy. Okay, so let me get on to the results. So first, we find that a one standard deviation increase in this proportion of parents with an elite degree will increase the probability of enrolling in an elite degree by 2.6 percentage points. That's on average across the sample, but when we redo this in the low SES and the high SES subsamples, you see that the effect for high SES is almost 2 to 3 times higher than it is for the low SES sample. I wanted to show you some of the sort of heterogeneity analysis that we did by gender, because those are very interesting. I have to confess that at this stage in the paper, this sort of early stage in the project, we thought, should we write a gender paper or should we write the socioeconomic paper? Because both were like super interesting. And essentially, so as you will see now, if we do the same for females and males separately, we find that there's still this socioeconomic gradient, but there's also, if you compare within socioeconomic group, there is an important gender gap as well, in that the male students benefit a lot more from being surrounded by elite peers than the females. Okay, so I'm a little bit short on time, so I hope you will trust me in saying that our robustness checks really strongly indicate that the identifying assumption seems to be valid in our case, because I would like to spend more time thinking about the mechanisms underlying this sort of benchmark result that I've presented so far. So as I said, this exposure to elite peers could affect our outcome, which is enrolling in an elite degree, either through its impact on high school GPA, knowing that high school GPA is a very important determinant of enrolling in an elite degree, or there could be a second mechanism, a sort of direct effect, which is conditional on GPA. Those elite peers could affect the application behavior of students. So first we're going to look at essentially this effect in orange, which is the effect of being exposed to elite peers on the high school GPA. And here, like I said, we're going to exploit the fact that the GPA is composed of grades from externally assessed, so blindly assessed written exams, as well as 2 types of teacher assessments. One are pure teacher assessments, really on all subjects over the 3 years. And there is another type of exam which are semi-externally assessed oral exams. They are assessed by both the teacher and an external examiner. Okay, but I will put these two in the sort of non-blind assessment category. So first of all, here, what is the effect of those elite peers on overall GPA? We re-estimate the same model, just changing the outcome now with overall GPA. And as you see, there is a negative effect of those elite peers on overall GPA. And this negative effect is much more strongly negative for the low SES group than for the high SES group. So to try and understand this a little bit better, we rerun the model on each component of GPA. Firstly, if we focused on these externally blindly assessed exams, what we find is that those elite peers actually have a positive effect on exam scores when they are blindly assessed. And this is the case for both low SES and high SES, and there's not much of a gradient here. And so if we think about those externally assessed grades as a sort of close to the sort of purest measure of human capital or learning or effort, however you want to think about the sort of mapping between the grades and the inputs going into that grade, here we would think that actually those elite peers have positive effects on the learning of students in the class. So what's happening in driving this negative effect on overall GPA is that actually those elite peers have a negative effect on all the exams where the teacher is involved in assessing the students. And as you see, it's even the strongest on those teacher assessments, where we find negative effects of elite peers for both the low SES and the high SES, but much more strongly negative for the low SES. We find pretty similar pattern for semi-externally oral exams, but a little bit magnitude, a little bit lower, and this could reflect the fact that the teacher only has sort of a partial involvement in that grade. So why is that the case, that we find this negative effect? So here there are sort of two sort of potential stories. So first, like if you think that teachers mark on a curve, those elite peers are high achieving, and so their presence in the cohort essentially mechanically is going to have a downward effect on the rank of other students, and is going to have more of a downward effect on those at lower in the distribution and those at the top of the distribution. So that would be one explanation for these negative effects, but stronger negative for the low SES than the high SES. So this is what we try to see by now estimating a slightly more flexible model, where we allow this elite peer effect to vary with the rank of the student in the cohort, but based on their middle school GPA. So this is sort of our measure of ability, of student ability. Here on this graph, we plot how this effect of elite peers vary with the rank of middle school GPA of the student. And we estimate different effects for low SES here in the dark shade, and high SES here in the lighter shade. What we see here that for both groups, we find that the lower you are in the distribution of ability, the stronger the negative effect is. So that would support, having this sort of mechanical rank effect. But there is still, conditional on rank, there is still the downward effect negative effect is still stronger for the low SES than it is for the high SES. And so this would suggest that actually on top of this sort of mechanical rank effect, the teachers might actually might have some bias, maybe implicit bias, against the low SES students in the classroom, and impart a stronger sort of penalty or a stronger downgrade for this group. And this sort of bias would actually be triggered and exacerbated by the presence of elite peers in the classroom.
But Sarah, why do you interpret this as teacher bias? Because it would seem like, so if I take the best student and I give them the 10, then all of the distribution backwards is going to be affected, right?
But here essentially you can say, okay, so a student at the sort of low, 20th percentile on the ability distribution.
Yeah.
So this student here is the same in terms of ability, but this student here comes from a high SES background, this student here from a low SES background.
Okay.
And you still see that, these guys, are the low SES ones, are much more penalized from having elite peers in the classroom than the high, similarly able ones, but from high SES backgrounds. Okay, great. So we've established that there is a negative effect of those elite peers on high school GPA. But if you remember, the overall effect of elite peers on the decision to enroll in an elite degree was positive. So it has to be that conditional on GPA, those elite peers have a positive effect on the enrolling in an elite degree. So now what we're going to try to do is quantify this positive effect. The way we have to do this is essentially rerunning our benchmark model, but this time controlling for GPA. The problem here is that GPA is very endogenous, and so we need to find a way of instrumenting this GPA to be able to identify the effect of elite peers on enrolling in an elite degree, conditional on GPA in an unbiased way. So to instrument, so this is the regression we would like to estimate. So to instrument high school GPA, we're going to exploit a feature of the Norwegian system, whereby in year 2 or year 3 of high school, students are essentially, students are going to have to take externally assessed exams, but the subjects in which they take these exams are randomly assigned within schools. So, given what we've seen, we know that for low SES students, actually being randomly assigned to a math exam, for example, which is going to be very important for their for going into an elite degree, they could benefit from this because it would place less weight on the teacher assessments. So we're going to use this variation to instrument the GPA, to instrument high school GPA, and as I will show you, being assigned to taking a math exam and being externally assessed in math in year 2 or 3 has indeed a very positive effect, a strong effect on GPA, overall GPA. But also because this is randomized within schools, we also think that it is a credible source of exogenous variation in GPA. In the paper, we show a lot more to confirm that. So let me get on to the results here. So first, our first stage, where we regress the high school GPA on our instrument being assigned to a math written exam. And as I just said, we confirm that indeed it has a positive effect on overall GPA. Now our second stage, where we're back to our model where the dependent variable is being enrolled in an elite degree, where we are now including both the proportion of parents with elite degree and also the overall high school GPA, which we instrument. We find that conditional on GPA, now the effect of our elite peers is of 0.038, so a 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of parents educated, of elite educated parents in the cohort, increase the probability of enrolling in an elite degree by 3.8 percentage points. This is for low SES students, okay? Because essentially this IV strategy works much better for low SES students than for high SES students, and you can think that because high SES students tend to be more at the top of the high school GPA distribution, there's much less margin for this randomization essentially to push their GPA up. So those results, that's why we place much more importance on credibility on the low SES results. Now when we put it all together and we try to see, well, what's the effect of this direct, or the magnitude of this direct effect relative to the magnitude of the negative indirect effect, we see that essentially about 70% in magnitude of this direct effect, about 70% of this that the indirect effect going through GPA is about 70% of the effect, of the positive effect of elite peers on enrolling in an elite degree.
So, sir, I understood that the idea of the instrument is that this is going to particularly benefit low SES because of the bias.
Yeah.
But then, like, are those two statistically different? Like the first stage, the slopes, are they statistically different?
You mean between the low and the high SES?
Yeah.
No, I don't think they would be. And you still see, I mean, if you, I think if you look at the second stage results, like the 0.038 and 0.054, they would be still, I think, statistically different. But the thing is that here, because the F-stat in our IV is only a 5 for the high SES, we just don't want to put too much weight on these results. So we're not really able to say for the high SES group what is this sort of direct effect. We should, I think, the results for the low SES are more sort of credible. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I just want to speak very quickly about the sort of long-term implications of these results for intergenerational income mobility. So if elite degrees have indeed positive returns for both low and high SES students, this exposure to elite peers in high school would increase earnings because they increased their enrollment in elite degrees, but potentially differently for low and high SES students. And so this means that essentially, if you remember, because of the segregation of elite peers in high schools, the low SES students are not so exposed to those elite peers. The high SES students are much more likely to be exposed. They also have a stronger effect on the probability of being enrolled than the elite peers have a stronger effect on the probability of being enrolled for the high SES than the low SES. So what this could be together, this could mean that actually the segregation of elite peers in high school could be a force exacerbating the intergenerational persistence of earnings in Norway. And so to test this hypothesis, we're essentially going to be using a subsample of our data set, those cohorts who by 2018, which was the last year of data that we had, are at least age 30, and we can see their earnings. What we're going to do here is first we're going to look at what is the elite degree premium, earnings premium for those two groups. And then we're going to be estimating the effect of those elite peers on earnings. So the first thing is to look at the effect of those elite degrees or on earnings. Here our outcome is earnings percentile. And if you look at, so we condition on whether the student goes to university, and then on top of that, whether they ever enroll in an elite degree. And you see that there is a very high premium to enrolling in an elite degree. And interestingly, this coefficient is a little bit lower for the low SES, but it's still very positive and strong for the low SES students. So that would mean if indeed they can enroll more in elite degrees, it could really push their earnings up. Now, sort of an implication of that is that and of the results before that I presented before, is that the effect of elite peers should be positive on earnings, should be positive for both low and high SES, but probably more strongly positive for high SES students than for low SES students. And indeed, this is what we find. Now, so putting all this together, like I said, in Norway, the fact that there are less exposure to elite peers among the low SES groups and more than among the high SES groups could mean that the low SES students are actually being disadvantaged in a way that they're not benefiting from what could be a really positive influence in making them more likely to pursue elite degrees. So just to confirm this, we run a sort of simulation whereby we reallocate students, high school students, in schools where there's high elite peer exposure to schools where there isn't, and so where there are going to be more low SES students, and we reallocate low SES students in those high elite peers schools. And we then predict what their earnings would be based on the estimates of the model that we got so far. So this is what we do in that we show. Sorry, I'm skipping a few slides because I see that I'm out of time. But then we predict the earnings after the reassignment that would essentially reduce the amount of segregation that there is in high school. And we re-estimate this rank-rank correlation. So what is the rank-rank correlation? Is the correlation between the earnings rank of the child with the earnings rank of the parent. And it's a standard way of measuring mobility. And so what we find here is that, so in the data, this rank-rank correlation, when we would do it, non-parametrically, so we allow it to vary across the rank distribution, you see that, so it's shown by the dark line, but once we've reassigned the students and reduced segregation in high school, you see that actually it's the rank of the students at the bottom of the parents' earnings distribution now increases, and so that essentially would reduce or increase sort of mobility. In conclusion, so this paper examines whether increasing the exposure of low SES students to elite peers at school can help them become first-generation elite and increase intergenerational mobility in education and earnings. And we show that indeed it's being exposed to elite peers can be a positive force in doing this, and that it could be explaining why the persistence in income actually in Norway is quite high at the top of the distribution, because those high SES students just are much more likely to keep being exposed to elite peers. And we also show that this SES gradient in elite peers is due to both positive spillovers of elite peers on the learning and effort of students, counteracted by the effect that elite peers have on how teachers assess students in the class. And so I think there are two sort of policy implications from our results. The first one that I think comes directly from those results looking at GPA and the different components of the GPA is that a higher reliance on blind assessments could actually mitigate the sort of detrimental effects of teacher bias. And the second one, which we showed that would be coming from the results where we look at the effect of elite peers on an elite degree enrollment conditional on GPA, which shows that those elite peers are indeed have a very positive influence on low SES students. It could hint at the fact that sort of role model mentoring programs that provide information to low SES students and encourage them to apply to these programs could also be beneficial in raising their chances to apply to elite degrees. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. You are on time, very British. Thank you. If there are any questions? Yes, please.
Just two quick questions, one conceptual and another technical. there was only one slide in the presentation about this, but I think that is quite important. Is the gender difference in the effect, and I think that this slide deserves a paper itself. But what do you think about the fact that your outcome variable is a kind of a mixture that includes a lot of gender heterogeneity? For instance, you include master or elite education that includes STEM education, medicine, and so if you look at the proportions, more or less, medicine and the other one, business, is kind of balanced, 50-50, but the other is like 80% unbalanced in favor of men. So, I mean, if you want to have a clear interpretation of this result, maybe, I don't know if you have the chance, would be to split this variable into, because if you look at the literature, you will see that the determinants of making STEM choice for women are different from the determinants. So I think that there you have a lot of individual heterogeneity that you will clean if you separate this. And the other thing is that when estimating peer effect is always a complicated thing, because as you may know, there is this reflection problem. That is that, I mean, if the variables that determine the belonging or the exposure to the reference group are correlated with the variables that determine the outcome, then inference with your parameter of interest, which is the peer variable, is quite complicated. So I really do trust that your robustness check is good. Okay. So
happy to show them.
No, it's not design, trust is basically that. But out of that, do you have information that allows you to test for this reflection problem? What means to have variables that explain the exposure to these people, to this group? What I'm anticipating was
So those would be variables that determine the choice of where people apply, where people...
So if you, for instance, you don't have into account in the analysis the variables that determine the exposure of individuals to this peer, to this group, then if these variables are correlated with the variables determining the outcome and you don't include in the relation, then you have a kind of a confounding effects in the peer variable that can be problematic. And I think that if you don't have into account this, you may have some troubles with this.
So we do have some of these variables. Obviously, you know, not there are many different factors, right, that could affect this. But we think so. Those would be controlled by what we include in the model, which is the middle school GPA, which is going to be the main determinant in those areas where it's selective admission to high schools, where the admission really is based on middle school GPA. We control for that in the model. And then in terms of, we also control for parents' education, parents' income, and I think we do have like some variables about parental occupation, and those would essentially are there to control for, you know, preferences of the family with respect to where they live, which could influence, you know, then the selection of high school in those areas where admission is based on catchment area. But I take your point for on the first comment. Like, I agree. Those results deserve further digging. Thank you.
Yes, please, Aurelio.
Related to the previous question and the heterogeneity of the subset of degrees. This is because, for example, I recently read an article in the Economies magazine, and there's an astonishing difference between PhD students pursuing math or physics degree and economics, for example, in the sense that there are students in economics, they are 3 or 4 times more likely to have parents with graduate degrees rather than in mathematics, for example. Or so they are more, say, third generation on mathematics or physics rather than, for example, other areas. And so that probably it could benefit to split because STEM is really very heterogeneous. Even STEM is very heterogeneous because it's not the same mathematics or physics rather than computer science, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, one question. So I was curious about whether you've done or wondered about what is the effect for the elite students of being in peer with non-elite students. So is it a zero-sum game, or are there complementarities to being joined with non-elite students also for the elite one, or is it just a?
I see. So whether they gain from being in the school with a high proportion of non-elite educated parents. That's an interesting question. We haven't looked at this, but
because it makes a big difference also for teaching it, right? Because of course you want to involve also the elite families, no? If you want to do this kind of stuff, and it's nice if you can say, well, also the elite one are gaining from this diversity of people which are not elite.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It could be interesting to look at this sort of. Is there any effect if we move away a little bit from those outcomes that are just educational attainment? I'm thinking that if we could look at the sort of occupations maybe, or like the subjects that they go into, whether being exposed to a more diverse like student body in a high school might broaden a little bit perhaps like the type of choices that they do later on. Yeah, that would be really interesting.
So I was wondering if the family background might be affected. So like this would be like I suppose a different channel that maybe
the family background.
Yeah, so like if one of your kids goes to is in a pool of of elite, high proportion people, that may affect the family background.
But those things, so you mean like for example like the parents meet high-powered parents in the school and they get a better job and then the income is increases and that could be something like that.
Or even family environment, they're like, oh, now I know what it means to be a parent. I should encourage my kid to do this and not that, and like, is there a way that you can look at that? Because maybe that would be on the channel of maybe F4.
I see what you mean. So I will think more about this, but I would think that that could be another channel. I don't have a great answer to this, but I will definitely think about it. Thank you.
Another question there.
First, on this, maybe an idea just as a check is to look at only kids, because they have no siblings, so no possible impact from family background. But
so we've looked at that like for a slightly different reason, because we thought that there is a literature like sort of showing that the older sibling has could have strong effects on the type of subjects that and the educational outcomes that the younger siblings have, and so we thought perhaps for those younger siblings those elite like those networks are less important than they are for firstborn. We didn't really find much evidence of that, but I think as you're like just thinking more, I think you're right, it could be a channel, but I think it wouldn't necessarily be a threat to our identification strategy, but it's one of the channels.
Exactly.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely.
no, but actually my question was like in your last experiment, in order to understand it properly. So what you showed is that the quantitative or the size of the effect for a low SES child to be placed in a high SES peer environment, this is larger than the potentially mechanical diminishing effect of the fact that when you join this group automatically becomes less the lower concentration of SES people, no? Because you're pushing lower SES people there. So this is it. So the positive effects overweight the
You mean
Yes,
at
yes.
the end, the sort of
Yeah.
simulation that we did? Yeah. So essentially, in the data, so the true, what we call true student earnings rank, but it's like what we see in the data. And so we plot what the student percentile rank is of the students for each percentile of the parents' earnings distribution when the child was 15 to 19. Okay, and so you see it's positively sloped in that those two students who have parents at the top of the distribution, they also have. And then what we see is that once you reduce the amount of segregation that there is in schools, so you reduce the exposure of high SES to elite peers and you increase the exposure of low SES, you see that in the earnings rank of the students in the low SES, so they will tend to be here on the graph, does increase.
It's a net benefit.
Exactly. They benefit from it. Interestingly here, perhaps the amount of reassignment that we did is not strong enough, but you could have imagined that actually the student ranks of the high SES would go below the true one we see in the data, and it's not the case. It seems pretty sticky, right? But yeah, the main point that we're trying to make is that indeed it's just to show, it's to try and quantify, how much this sort of segregation in high school is important in driving in the persistence.
And then it would be very stylistic knowing whether you have enough data to see whether it's mother's elite education or father's elite education, which
I have results on this actually. There's something that we looked at. Actually, I think they are in here. Yeah. So this was when we did split by gender. But you see, for females, actually, it's only whether they're much more influenced by the fathers having an elite, the peers' fathers having an elite degree, which was not what we expected. But for males, it's much more similar between the two. So again, something I think really worth digging more into.
Yeah, just for clarification, could you give us some sort of value of these effects? I mean, when you say for the treatment, one standard deviation change, could you please give us some measure of that? Because it seems to me, I don't know if I'm wrong, so just correct me here. So the distribution is quite skewed. So the concentration of high skill, high SES students, it's limited to a small number of high schools, correct? Yeah. So then I guess the standard deviation is a big number for the standard deviation. So two questions here. One is it possible to really change in terms of policy, so to create a one standard change? So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And then actually the effect it's small. So I mean, for a big change in terms of policy, you end up with an effect that is rather small. If I am correctly interpreting your results, I couldn't just. So because you said it's about 3 percentage points. So how you consider that, big, small? I mean, at the end of the day, we may have to introduce a huge change on something that actually will have a really small effect. That's, what do you think about that?
Yes.
And actually then, if the effect comes from concentration of high SES students, families or whatever, students, if you distort that, if you balance it, would the effect disappear?
If we balance what? What did you say?
So I mean, if you distribute high SES students
Across. Yeah, I
with
see.
the effect. So I mean, it's I don't know. It's hard to interpret.
Would
the results.
you mean would the inequalities in outcomes disappear if you did it?
My point is that if inequality creates effect,
Yeah,
when you equalize, when you balance it out,
yeah.
would the effect disappear?
Oh, I see. Okay. So just taking on the first questions, like I think this is a really good point, and the standard deviation is a little bit. Yeah, I think you're right that we could also have an alternative unit for this. Because indeed, if you look at just our descriptive statistics, the standard deviation in this variable is quite large, right? Like for low SES, for example, it's the same as the average. So it's a fairly large effect. So it would be good to think perhaps about more sort of realistic scenarios.
Scaling.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in terms of the magnitude of the effect, obviously it's related a little bit by what we think this jump, right, in elite peers, what would be a realistic jump is. But if you just look at the standard deviation increase, which might be too much of a jump, it's actually, so for low SES, it was 1.3 percentage points increase in the outcome. And so it's about one fourth of the probability of the baseline probability that they enroll. So it's quite a large effect. So even if with a smaller sort of treatment, it could still be quite, I think, meaningful, a meaningful sort of economically speaking. I think on your other point, like I think. Are you suggesting that if we had more or less segregation in the system, so a more equal distribution of elite peers across schools, would we still see any effect of elite peers?
Well, my point actually is that the change is basically in the behavior of both students and teachers.
Yeah.
Students try harder to just keep up with their peers. I guess that is a reasonable way to put it. And teachers maybe, I don't know, it's easier to just, for a few students, these are not really, okay. So the effect comes from this concentration.
Yeah.
So once you, as I said, balance or have a more mixed, equal distribution, then for the students, the role models that they may look at may be more diverse, so that the effect could just go down.
I see what
reasonably. So you are not expected to do that well. Yeah. You won't be an outlier, an outlier in a class that is more like you. And for teachers, maybe it's just more difficult to singly pick one student and say you are not the good one. So maybe the grading is more equal. So what exactly? It's just
this is really interesting, right? So I think it's sort of if I understand correctly, it's sort of like I think the sort of general equilibrium effects of reallocating students across schools, right? And so in a sense, the sort of simulation that we do assumes those away. But and when we simulate what reallocating, we just use the coefficients that we estimated in this segregated context. I take the point, absolutely. I don't know what it would be, but
I think it's a policy that is a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.